so much for being here. So obviously we got some snacks. I didn't realize that they were going to shut down their summer hours as early as they did, but help yourself to that. We have peach whiskey jam over there. It's so good, right? So this is the last of the Regenerative Landscaping Speaker Series talks, and I'm so grateful to three main groups of people. One is our speakers. This is our list of all the speakers we had. This was Katrina Blair, we had Brooke Safford, and then we have the guys from Table to Farm Compost, Taylor and Chris. And then we had Jonathan and, oh my gosh, Adrian, thank you, with Durangos, and they're amazing as well. And then I'm doing the last talk. So amazing lineup of speakers, and we are filming all of these talks, so they are going to be uploaded when we get those produced and get them on so you guys can see them if you'd like to catch up on them. And then also our sponsors, our amazing sponsors here. I honestly couldn't have done this without the sponsors, so I'm so grateful. And then everybody who's attended as well. Some of you have made almost all of the talks, or all of them. So super appreciative. So this talk series was created to help my HOA transition away from toxic chemicals to regenerative practices on our lands. And I'll say there have been some successes, but overall it's very difficult to deal with kind of entrenched mind frames around how we deal with land, especially since industrializing in like the 1950s. Post-World War II, we took all of those chemicals from the war and we turned them into peacetime food production. And it worked for a little bit, the soil was still really robust and healthy. And so then when you're adding synthetic nitrogen and things like that, then it really helps to boost yield, but that's not working anymore. And then with the pesticides, when you have monocrop cultures, like thousands of acres planted of one thing, then a pest can just lay waste to the entire crop because nature would never do that. So that's the reason we have to have pesticides, and a lot of people don't realize that connection. It's like as we have more biodiversity, the need for these toxic pesticides goes away because nature has its own way of actually signaling to each other, like plants can actually signal to other plants that there's something coming, and they can make more of like their chemicals to prevent that attack. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. So but the ideas are out there and people are talking, and that's the most important part. So funny enough, I just wrote this talk today. I used to get mad at myself for taking forever and waiting to the last minute, but I've realized it's my process. And what I love about it is it allows me to pick up things that I might have not thought about if I had written it 2 weeks ago. So it's like a book that I'm reading or like something I see in the news, I can just pop that into my talk. So today this all kind of came this morning, and I'm just like and came up with something I'm really excited to share with you all. So for this final talk, we're going to be focusing on how we think and our perceptions of the world. Our human population has now become so numerous that the way we collectively think and then the actions that come from that way of thinking has the ability to either degenerate or regenerate the entire planet at this point. And we are in a vast cycle of degeneration right now. It is possible to flip this around, but we've kind of created this snowball thing that's happening. So our thoughts and beliefs determine our decisions and actions, and in turn that shapes our world. So we forget that we come from nature, we live because of nature, and eventually we return to nature. And we keep breaking those connections because we, think that we're not connected or something. So I went to, back in 2016, I went to an Academy for Integrative Health and Medicine conference out in San Diego. And I remember it was like a lot of practitioners, a lot of Western medical doctors wanting to figure out how they could treat more of what's going on with the actual person as opposed to the symptomatic, more traditional way that we do in Western medicine. So it was like 2,000, mostly doctors, and we went into this breakout session. And this doctor, like that breakout session was packed. It was like a smaller room, but there were 200 of us. It was lined, we were standing in the back. And the doctor started out the talk with, if anything touches plastic, it has plastic chemicals in it. And you could just see all the doctors kind of look around like, oh crap, they're kind of embarrassed. They have like their hot coffee sitting in a plastic container or whatever, and the heat makes those chemicals leach even more. And I don't know if you remember, but we had the whole BPA free thing that blew up, what was that, maybe 15 years ago or something. And so it's interesting because the chemical companies use that to be like, oh, we're gonna market the crap out of this. What do we think it's made out of? Like BPA-free actually is protecting us from toxic chemicals. No, there's BPA-S and all these other chemicals that are leaching in, but it worked out because now people are like, oh, I feel safe because I can buy BPA-free. So anyway, we think about, how do we do source-to-source analysis? That's really what I'm starting to term this now, which is basically a nature-to-nature analysis. You think about the full life cycle of a product or of food or anything, and you can really determine from that, would nature do this? And that kind of tells you whether or not it's going to be healthy for you and the planet. So looking at plastic water bottle, it's a perfect example. So where does that come from? Petrochemicals. So we are making these plastics from petrochemicals, and it becomes something that the planet doesn't recognize. Obviously, it came from the planet, but we turn it into something that the planet no longer recognizes. Then we look at the lifespan of that plastic water bottle, and you might even leave it in the car and it gets hot, and then when you drink it, it tastes like plastic. Wonder why? So we're causing carcinogens to go into our body just from that plastic water bottle. And then you look at the end of life for that plastic water bottle. More than likely, that bottle is going to go into landfill or the oceans. That's just what it is. Only 9% of all virgin plastic has ever been recycled, ever. And that is, plastic started being made, I think it was like late 1800s, but really blew up in like the mid 1900s. So all of that plastic has not been recycled, and now we're heading towards more plastic in the oceans than fish. So unfortunately, any kind of recycling, it's a nice idea, makes us feel good, but it's not really working. So we have to start thinking, okay, if we're looking at this source-to-source analysis or life cycle analysis, how do we start thinking like nature, and how do we make decisions from that more holistic context? So I want to utilize the whiteboard and draw out like a big picture of 3 of our main reasons why we have really tipped the scales in a bad direction in terms of the systems of Earth and just planetary health. It's not like climate change. I always get this. People are like, but climate change, it's a natural thing. Yeah, but not at this pace. We are going at a breakneck speed right now, and the planet cannot evolve quickly enough, right? So what are the things that we have done that have really been these tipping points? So I'm going to bring Zoom up here so they can see the board. Somebody just jumped on. All right. Okay, hopefully that will work. Okay, so we have soil over here. See, my drawing is really good. All right, soil, so land. And this is a very simplified version, but I think it really helps to be able to wrap our heads around this big picture of what we're dealing with. So soil, we have atmosphere, so climate, and then we have water and oceans, or just oceans. Okay, so 3 main systems that we're dealing with on the planet. And so the first thing that we've done, and all of this is kind of stemming from the soil side, so we have taken tons of fossil fuels, which is really just ancient sunlight, if you think about it. It's petrified and compressed algae and things like that. It's mostly plant material. We think, you hear that it's dinosaurs, but really it's like algae from forever ago. It's like 350 million years ago. So we were able to find this, and now we're taking it out of below the crust of the Earth, right? So it's this magic fuel that for some reason we think is going to last forever. That's not going to happen. It's a totally finite resource. There are some scientists out there that are saying we're going to be out of it in 10 to 20 years. That's mind-blowing because our entire planet is based on fossil fuel at this point, right? So, for transportation and moving goods around. So that is starting to lead to CO2 in the atmosphere. And when carbon is in the soil, where it really is healthy, then, it's not like there's not a carbon cycle, but we've taken tons of carbon out of the earth, and tons of it is here and also in the water. So I'll explain that side in a second. So we have carbon, we have CO2 that is starting to really blow up in the atmosphere, or not starting to, it has. So we have a legacy load of carbon in the atmosphere. Then the second thing we've done with the land is we've done all of these industrial actions on the land. So tilling and things like that, like back when the pioneers first started tilling up the grasslands, they said it sounded like bullwhips cracking because that was all the root systems that were snapping from the tilling. And then we've done more things like chemicals and the pesticides, monocrops, all the things that nature would never do, right? Nature would never create something that wasn't diversified and healthy and feeding on itself as far as a community. So we've done all these industrial actions on the land that has really created not just carbon release from the soil, but then on top of it, we have, wait, that should have been, no, that works. Okay, now, and then the other aspect is we have broken carbon's return to the land. So when we have things like these industrial actions on the land and we don't have plants like living roots in the ground, that is the pathway that carbon makes it back into the soil through photosynthesis. Plants literally eat sunlight and carbon dioxide, and they release that oxygen molecule, and then it becomes carbon. And things like grasslands are second only to oceans in their ability to sequester carbon. It goes deep and it stays. Unlike trees, which trees are very important, but it stays in their trunks and in their branches. So when they're cut down, we lose that carbon storage. So all of these things, so here, we have no more of this. All right, so 3 main things happening here. Legacy load of carbon here. What do we think is happening over here? Well, the oceans, like I said, grasslands are second only to oceans in their ability to store carbon. So oceans are becoming acidified, so this is now becoming carbonic acid when the CO2 enters the water. So acidifying, and on top of that, 93% of the heat in the atmosphere is absorbed by the oceans. Without oceans, we would be at an average 122 degree Fahrenheit average surface temperature, or average air temperature. So oceans are really kind of going to bat for us without us realizing it, but they're reaching their tipping point. So when I see this, I think it's like this. Everything's tipped, right? And it's like what we need to do is heal the land so that it can start bringing that carbon back down and starting to relieve not just the legacy load of carbon in the atmosphere that we need to deal with, and also dealing with our level of current emissions, but also starting to unburden the oceans. Like shell-growing animals can't grow shells anymore. We've got coral reefs dying from the insane warmth that's happening in the ocean. So all kinds of issues with just this way of thinking. And that has determined how we've treated the land, and that has created this entire kind of backwards cycle. So just to ask real quick, does this make sense, like in a really big picture? I'm hoping it's kind of like, oh yeah, I see like how it's not doing what it should be doing over here, and everything's kind of tipping on this side, yeah? Hopefully, kind of. I don't know, it's like a lot to think about. Okay, any questions?
Actually, I do.
Oh yes, what?
I don't want to interrupt you.
No, you're good. Ask away.
Okay. What's keeping the CO2 from going back to the land?
So when we don't have healthy living root systems, like we've covered a lot of things with, either roadways or cities or whatever, plus fallow land. Yep, and we've kind of ruin the soil microbiome system as well. So when you don't have all of that activity that would normally be happening in the soil, then it doesn't have its route, because it's really through photosynthesis that happens. So yeah, I mean, it's still happening, just not at the level it should be. Plus, as I'll explain here in a little bit, we've broken so many of nature's connections to herself that even land that looks like it's healthy isn't, because it's either oxidizing like the grasslands, or you don't have animals moving through the forest the way they would. So we have just a lot of things that are needing to be kind of processed the way nature would, but they're really, nature's absent from itself, Drink the water.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you tell me again, sorry, what the orange lines are?
Yes. All of this awesomeness. Okay, so fossil fuels that we've taken out of the planet, this is industrial actions on the land, so mostly industrial ag. We lose 75 billion tons of topsoil per year, mostly due to faulty agricultural practices, and that's also releasing carbon. So I should have this. Yep, carbon. So yeah, this is just industrial stuff on the land. And then this is the lack of ability for the soil to get the kind of carbon sequestration it needs. So everything in nature operates as a closed loop system. And these three main things, I talked about the oceans. Yeah, so a lot of times I love to talk to people about it matters how something was grown or raised, not what it is that you're actually eating. So if you come here and you eat a regenerative meat burger or a regenerative veggie burger, you are helping the oceans, because the way those things are produced, grown, raised, that's sequestering carbon in the soil. That is creating water retention. It's creating local watershed health as well. So much good comes from local regenerative food, products, services, all of that. So that's a way we can really have massive impact and on our health as well. So yeah, I just love having that conversation with people that's like, yeah, we're in a landlocked state, but look at what you can do that actually has this massive impact, because it's helping deal with this, which is helping unburden the oceans. So yeah, when any part of nature is sick, it impacts everything, because everything is connected. And this throws off our hydrologic cycles. This is where we're getting our crazy storms right now, because the oceans are warming, they're acidifying, it's creating weirder and weirder weather patterns. So we're getting more and more floods and like just all this stuff we can't really predict, and it's happening faster and faster. And it's creating a vulnerability in terms of wildfires out here in the West, droughts, floods, erosion, all of that kind of stuff, which I'll talk a little bit about the ability to actually reverse that here in a sec. So worldwide, we've disconnected nature from herself, and we've disconnected ourselves from nature. And it's for some reason, we think that we know best. We think we're separate from nature, and yet everything about us is based on nature. And so it's really not natural for this to happen. It's why we're sick. It's why the planet's sick. And so it becomes this fatal mistake, because it's the true source of all of our problems. So when we reconnect all of these relationships, then that's how we have individual health and also planetary health. So the relationships that must be restored are what we're going to look at next. So how do we go about actually positively impacting the problems of the world, like climate change? How do we help to restore balance? It's actually not hard. We don't need carbon-sucking machines. We don't need electric vehicles. Like, we don't need those things. There's going to be these transition pieces, but we don't actually need those things. Really what we need to do is reconnect these relationships. So there's three categories that I see. One is reconnecting nature to herself. Second is reconnecting ourselves to nature, and then connecting with each other again in true community, which is not really how we live in the industrialized nations. An example of a relationship that needs to be restored is ruminants and more arid areas, like the grassland areas like you see out here. So there's a reason why these cattle are never all over the land. And so when you reconnect ruminants the way nature would have them move, because for example, you had massive herds of bison moving all over North America, pushed by predators like wolves. And so it kept them moving. They would have massive impact really quick, and then they would be moving on and they wouldn't come back. So it gives time for that area to regenerate. And so what's interesting is you can have land that is overgrazed, and you can have land that's overrested, because really these animals co-evolved with the planet. And so when you have these areas where you have like a monsoon season and like winter, but you have times of the year where it's dry, you actually need these ruminant animals like cows, goats, sheep, elk, deer. All these animals are like walking compost systems. They're amazing. And the nutrient cycling and moisture cycling that the grasslands need is in their systems. And so there's this whole movement right now. I just looked up an article that I think in Ireland, they're wanting to cull, I don't know how many thousands of cows, because they think that's the problem. And it's like, no, these animals have been here forever. They co-evolved with this land. It is how we think, which has determined, oh, we're gonna put them in concentrated animal feeding operations, and we're gonna feed them stuff that they can't digest. Their manure no longer is gold out on the field. They're having to stand in it. They're sick. They're on antibiotics. So many bad things have come from this. So when people, ask about, okay, well, what do you think about meat? And it's like, well, where's it coming from? Is it coming from a CAFO? Because no, it's awful. You also have higher omega-6 in that meat, and having that high omega-6 and a lower omega-3 is one of the aspects that makes that beef unhealthy. But when you have really good grass-fed beef, then you have higher omega-3, which is that healthy fat that we really need. And so what's interesting is, like, when you're going around and you see a field with cattle all over it, you might think, yay, it's grass-fed. Yeah, but it's actually not regenerating the land. And that's the reason why you don't see cattle all over their land here. They move them with electric fencing, and that is what mimics the predators, how they would have been moving these animals. So through that, these ranchers go through this whole planning process every year, trying their best to mimic nature. And then they're re-evaluating all the time because it's based on how much rain did they get, how much grass growth is happening, how long should the animals be in this one place before they move on to have impact in another. So you can actually see the lines in the grass when you look, and that's where the electric fencing was. And we have different stages of regrowth that's happening out there. So when these ruminant animals are out there in their herd ways of moving, you have the impact from their hooves, which is pressing in seeds. It's allowing water infiltration because it's kind of this light tilling on the soil the way nature would do it. The way their mouths tear at the grass actually spurs growth. And when they're not always in one spot, they're not just eating one plant down to nothing, because they definitely have their things that they love, and so they'll just eat. And once it gets to a certain point, then that plant is no longer regenerating at the same level because it starts to pull from the root systems. So that's a desertifying effect, which is what's happening with grasslands across the world. Also in their saliva, they have all this healthy bacteria that helps with that soil microbiome as well. Plus, like I said, walking compost facilities. Their urine and dung is amazing for out there. And so this is how we reconnect nature to herself, but it's not just, it's stepping back and thinking what connection have we broken and how can we reconnect that? And this is one of those ways. I think it's one of the #1 ways to deal with what we have happening on the planet. Alan Savory from Savory Institute says that if we regenerated just half of the world's grasslands, we would go back to pre-industrial levels of carbon in the atmosphere, so pre-1850. And it could happen very fast because, interestingly, nature's natural way of being is regenerative. We're the ones who are creating that degenerative, we're impeding that ability. So, when you step back and you see a big picture like this and you realize, oh, it's thinking from the realm of how would nature do things, you realize it's not that hard. And then it's like, how do we start having these conversations so that we can start coming up with actual good ideas? Like, what does a transition look like to a regenerative way of living? Let's see. So this is, the example of thinking like nature, the source-to-source analysis. We can do this with literally everything, whether it's clothing, whether it's food, whether it's what you store your food in. We can do things that are being produced better and are creating better health impacts for us. Because, like, for example, storing your food in a glass container is better than plastic because you're not getting the leaching plastic chemicals into your food. And so, yes, I agree that we are we're modern industrial humans. People are like, okay, well, how do we go about this when our whole global society is based on this more fossil fuel industrial way of being? And it's really getting in community with each other and starting to have these conversations where we can develop this more regenerative mindset and help, not just ourselves, but others transition to a more regenerative lifestyle, because the impact is amazing. So tying this back into regenerative landscaping, previous talks covered how pointless and toxic the chemicals are, the synthetic fertilizers, and a really poignant aspect of that is that 95% of terrestrial life is in the soil. So everything we see up here is only 5%. 95% is below the soil. There's insane stuff happening down there that we don't even know, it's just nuts. And so what's really cool, and this is how we are nature, our microbiomes are very much like the planet. We are 10 times microbial cells compared to human cells. So we're just like these sacks of organisms walking around. And same with the soil. It's like that is the microbiome of the planet, and all life depends on that healthy topsoil. So making sure that it's healthy and we're in relationship with nature and actually asking nature, what would you do? Let's actually think about origin of species and how things actually operated, because that provides a lot of context. For example, chickens are tropical birds, but we have massive issues with aerial predators in areas like this, but we love chicken eggs and we love chickens, and so we have them out here, but then we have to think, okay, how do we protect them? Because they're used to being able to roost in their tropical areas. They're not in areas like this. So when you start to trace back these origins, you start to understand, and then you can be like, okay, how do we do this in a way that's regenerative and healthy and humane and all of these aspects? An example as far as our landscapes, a non-toxic and biodiverse landscape, that keeps our pollinator populations healthy. And when you realize that 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat is because of pollinators, you realize how incredibly important that is. So right now we have 40 million acres of grass covering the US. And people are like, oh, we don't have enough food to, or enough land to grow food. Yes, we do. We need to transition that kind of stuff into biodiverse landscapes, pollinator-friendly habitats, food growing areas. I mean, it's right there, And so when soil is healthy, also the food is nutrient dense. So that's another thing. If you're getting industrial organic food, which is like a lot of times, unless you have a James Ranch market and grill, that's the best you can really do. It still doesn't have the nutrient density that you really want because there's still industrial actions happening on that land. So they're still planting in monocrops. They're still having to do some tilling. So you really need to know, like the farmer and, hey, that's okay. You really need to know the source, and you start to understand these practices of the fact that when ranchers and farmers are really, the ones who actually care about the soil and are really hell-bent on taking care of it. And from that, you're going to have non-toxic food and more nutrient-dense food. At this point, you'd have to eat, I think it's 15 grapes to equal 1 grape 70 years ago. You'd have to eat 6 apples to equal 1 apple 70 years ago. We have really destroyed the soil microbiome, which has destroyed nutrient density. So we're eating all this food, but it's empty and it's toxic. And we keep this cycle going and we don't have to. We can start transitioning to this beautiful, regenerative, nurturing way to be with the planet and with our food. So, so it's what's interesting too about toxic pesticides, herbicides, synthetic fertilizers, it actually keeps us from getting the very thing that our bodies and souls need, which is health and connection. So that's how easy it is though. It's like it seems like everything's bad, you see the news, you see all these horrible stories, and it's like, but we can start reversing this, and it's really not that difficult. So it's time to flip the script, it's time to change the narrative. And it's from one of destruction and disconnection to one of regeneration and community. And everything we need to regenerate literally the entire planet is in this room right now. Thank goodness you showed up. Now we've got more. So it's how we think, it's how we connect, and it's the ripple effect of doing that. So I don't know if you knew, but there are dormant seeds in the land out there just waiting for the right conditions. Some of them have been there for hundreds of thousands of years, and we think they're extinct, but the right conditions, and here they are again. And I believe it's the same with our fabric of human society, that as we start to reconnect, there are these dormant seeds of love, connection, and creativity just waiting for the right conditions. So we have the ability to do this. So I want to read. So see, this is what's fun about writing my talk last minute. I can read to you from my recent book, Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures by Merlin Sheldrake. It is an awesome book, and he is a biologist and a writer. He received a PhD in tropical ecology from the University of Cambridge for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama, where he was a pre-doctoral research fellow at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And so I'm just picking out some fun things to read to you all because I think it really kind of puts a great point on the talk. So many of our most dramatic events on Earth have been and continue to be a result of fungal activity. Plants only made it out of the water around 500 million years ago because of their collaboration with fungi, which served as their root systems for tens of million years until plants could evolve root systems on their own. Today, more than 90% of plants depend on mycorrhizal fungi, which can link trees in shared networks, sometimes referred to as the wood wide web. This is a new way for WWW, right? This ancient association gave rise to all recognizable life on land, the future of which depends on the continued ability of plants and fungi to form healthy relationships. The impact of fungal diseases is increasing across the world. Unsustainable agricultural practices reduce the ability of plants to form relationships with the beneficial fungi on which they depend. The widespread use of antifungal chemicals has led to an unprecedented rise in new fungal superbugs that threaten both human and plant health. As humans disperse disease-causing fungi, we create new opportunities for their evolution. The best estimate suggests that there are between 2.2 and 3.8 million species of fungi in the world, 6 to 10 times the estimated number of plant species, meaning that a mere 6% of all fungal species have been described. We are only just beginning to understand the intricacies and sophistications of fungal lives. Most plants depend on fungi to provide them with nutrients from the soil, such as phosphorus or nitrogen, in exchange for energy-giving sugars and lipids produced in photosynthesis, the process by which plants eat light and carbon dioxide from the air. The relationship between plants and fungi gave rise to the biosphere as we know it and supports life on land to this day, but we seem to understand so little. It's microbiology, physiology, land management, agriculture, forestry, ecology, economy, and climate change. You really have to take a holistic perspective. Truffles, this is about truffles, they're so fascinating. Truffles appear quickly unspool into entire ecosystems. Scientific understanding has not yet caught up. You have to acknowledge that the soil is full of life. You cannot cultivate truffles without thinking at the level of an ecosystem. Mycelium is ecological connective tissue, the living seam by which much of the world is stitched into relation. And then the last part is his prologue, and I just thought it was a great introduction to all of this. The tree's roots wound outward from the base of its trunk, soon vanishing into the thick drifts of fallen leaves that covered the floor of the jungle. I used a stick to tap the ground for snakes. A tarantula scuttled off, and I knelt, feeling my way down the tree's trunk and along one of its roots into a mass of spongy debris where the finer roots matted into a thick red and brown tangle. A rich smell drifted upward. Termites clamored through the labyrinth, and a millipede coiled up playing dead. My root vanished into the ground, and with a trowel, I cleared the area around the spot. I used my hands and a spoon to loosen the top layer of earth and dug as gently as I could, slowly uncovering it as it ranged out from the tree and twisted along just below the surface of the soil. After an hour, I had traveled about a meter. My root was now thinner than string and had started to proliferate wildly. It was hard to keep track of as it knotted with its neighbors, so I lay down on my stomach and lowered my face into the shallow trench I had made. Some roots smell sharp and nutty and others woody and bitter, but the roots of my tree had a spicy resinous kick when I scratched them with a fingernail. For several hours, I inched along the ground, scratching and sniffing every few centimeters to make sure I hadn't lost the thread. From these roots, a fungal network laced out into the soil and around the roots of nearby trees. Without this fungal web, my tree would not exist. Without similar fungal webs, no plant would exist anywhere. All life on land, including my own, depended on these networks. I tugged lightly on my root and felt the earth move. So, what's it going to be? Are we just going to kick the can down the road again? We need to take care of the place that takes care of our offspring. This is the time. Thank you. That's it. Questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for this talk and all the talks you put together. I want to say that first. It's
Thank you.
Great work you're doing, and I love your holistic. Thank you for bringing a holistic view for us.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could talk a little more about like the soil's ability to absorb carbon, trees' ability, and grass's ability. For a while we've been hearing about we've got to plant more trees. That's the only way we're going to solve this problem.
Yep.
And then, well, trees can't grow everywhere, and obviously they take a long time to grow. So also, I'm curious, like, how much of those things you were just talking about, all those amazing things that live in the soil, are they absorbing carbon? Or is it the grass, and they're helping the grass and the trees grow?
Yeah, so I'll start with that part first. So what's really cool is the symbiotic relationship of the mycorrhizal fungi with the root systems. They actually release a substance called glomalin, which was only discovered in 1996, and it's actually like 40% carbon. But what it is a glue that actually creates soil aggregates, which are like little lumps of soil. So that is how you create porosity in the soil and water holding capacity. So when we have more soil organic matter, that's what increases that ability. So this was something I didn't say. For every 1% of soil organic matter added to an acre of land, that acre can hold an extra 20,000 gallons of water. There are farmers and ranchers out here adding 5 to 7% soil organic matter in a matter of like less than 10 years, 5 years. It's happening. And so as we reconnect like ruminants to the land the way they should be moving, as we do these things like compost applications, compost teas, things that really are feeding that soil microbiome, that's how we actually create more topsoil, which is what we need. So yeah, they have connected with those plant roots, and they have this relationship of, nitrogen fixing bacteria are feeding the plant roots, and they've got the connections with mycorrhizal fungi. So it's this whole thing happening, and in that is how carbon is sequestered and the ability for land to hold more water, which helps us not be so vulnerable to wildfire, for example. So the guys with Durangos, Jonathan and Adrian, they had pictures in their talk, which again, that's gonna be posted so you guys can see it, but showed the line of grazing. Literally, the fire stopped where grazing started. It's absolutely insane, and that is that connection to the land that we've broken. So as we start to get these relationships going again, then we're actually dealing with all of the things like erosion, floods, droughts, wildfires, all that. And as you have more roots in the ground, you have transpiration, which is literally like the plants sweating. So they have stomata on the bottoms of their leaves, and so that's how they actually seed local rainfall, which helps the local watershed, but that connects to the global hydrologic cycle, and that's how we rebalance that huge system as well. So all these things, like, that's why I say it's really not that hard, because nature's natural way to be is to regenerate. So as we start to get in relationship with nature again, then those things are gonna start to snowball. It's not like we have to think of everything, you know? And then as far as, so grasslands, they can, sequester carbon super deep, and it can stay for hundreds of thousands of years. I'm trying to think of what the question was that you asked me with that one.
Grasslands as opposed to
Trees.
planting trees as a carbon sequestering solution.
Yeah, so again, it's that holistic context. Boy, that's getting loud out there, isn't it? So it's that holistic context. There's a really great picture in Alan Savory's Holistic Management book. I wish I had it. But he literally has this picture of where in the desert or something, they planted like a ton of trees, and then there was no relationship of plants around those trees, so there's no connection in the soil. So it's just literally this desert sand blowing through the trees. So it's like, you have to look at the landscape, you have to do this holistic perception of the land, of asking it, like, what is it trying to be? What things should be growing here? Like, we need to start asking those kinds of questions, as opposed to the more like control, domination, industrial mindset of like, this is what we're gonna plant here and it's gonna be fine, and then things like that happen. So I think trees are a great part of the solution, but a lot of times, like with the biofuel, like, you go on a flight and you offset your carbon with a biofuel, whatever, they just plant like these monocrops of trees, like in Sweden, and then they cut them down. So it's not really doing anything, and those forests aren't forests. They don't have the relationships happening. It's like these kind of weird, creepy, like manufactured forests that don't really have life, because it's not the way nature would do it. So again, it's kind of getting out of, yes?
I was wondering if I could comment on this.
Yes, please do.
So, I'm one of the family members here at the ranch, and we're actually working right now on planting a lot more trees and creating more of a savanna on the ranch.
Yeah.
Because, especially in the unirrigated parts of the ranch, we see way better grass production underneath trees. And so we really don't think about it as like the trees versus grass thing. It's all interconnected. So in the areas where we have trees, they're pulling water up from much deeper and sharing that with the plants around them. They're providing shade when it's hot, so it's cooling temperature, it creates a better growing environment. And then in winter, it's actually warmer around the trees. So like in the early spring, that's the first place we have green grass is under trees.
I'm gonna stand next to you because of the microphone.
There's infinite biomes. So this one in particular, where we have a grassland that we're turning into a savanna, we see that relationship. Up in the mountains, it's obviously different, and there's not really any grasses. It's carpeted with bilberries, mostly up in the mountains. But yeah, if there's just one or the other, it's never going to be as good as combined.
So it's kind of like silvopasture.
Kind of like
So silvopasture,
silvopasture.
Silvopasture works great here.
Silvopasture.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a great example. And then if you have trees, you have much more biodiversity species-wise.
Yeah, so in creating that savanna-like aspect it's kind of like looking at what would this be, like without us impeding it and trying to recreate that, so that's what they're working on.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
I actually think of savanna, I think of just like grasslands. So I'm not really sure of the definition of
So grasslands interspersed with trees.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So not a forest as in like the trees canopies are overlapping, but there's lone trees or groups of trees interspersed with grassland.
And then you can run ruminants through that too, right?
Yeah.
So And you
then
create
they
that
have something to
regeneration.
scratch on, they have cover. You know,
Right.
It's really good.
No. Yeah, cool, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, so, okay, I think, many people in this room are, sold on the regenerative landscaping idea.
Yes.
But there's so much money sunk into the degenerative system. I'm just wondering, what kind of prospect do you see for that changing? Are there enough James ranches,
It's hard, it's really hard, so, yeah.
Make sure you repeat the question for Zoom.
Oh yeah, so he's asking, it's very difficult to go against the influx of industrial actions as far as like how we produce food and stuff, so how do we transition, basically, right? How do we go against that? So we're actually working on a bill that we're gonna be presenting to the state of Colorado to provide, it's a 20% tax credit for restaurants to start buying local regenerative food, just to create, like it's just one aspect, right, of how do we create impact in any way we can, and that's a way to kind of maybe start that snowball going the other direction. Also, I think what's really going to be impactful is the more people understand this, the more they can ask questions because they're educated about what regenerative actually means. And then they're asking for that in restaurants, at markets, things like that. So it helps to create more ability for that locally to happen. But yeah, it's difficult because we have land prices that are high. It's hard for farmers to access land. It's really hard for industrial ag farmers to transition because you have to heal that land. It takes a while. So they literally have this gap in production. And a lot of times they end up having to go back to industrial processes before the land has healed because they just can't hold out. So we're subsidizing, and that's one of the big things. We're subsidizing industrial crops, industrial ag, and all of that money. So I think it's working from multiple angles, but it's grassroots groups, it's talks like this, it's some of the bills we're starting to see happen. Like there's some really cool stuff happening. Kate Greenberg, our agricultural commissioner in Colorado, she's got some cool stuff she was telling us about that's gonna help, I wanna say it's schools access more local food as well. So I think as these things happen, it's gonna start more of like a snowball. That's the hope, because it is hard. Yeah. Yeah, oh, yeah.
Oh, well, if you are going to be presenting a bill, it sounds to me like you first have to define, get that good housekeeping seal of approval. There has to be something that says this is regenerative.
Right. So there are some, she asked, is that what you're asking? Okay. She asked, how do we prove that something's regenerative? So there are some really cool certifications that are starting to happen. One is through Savory Institute. They have a land to market program and an EOV certification process that is an ecological outcome verified. So what's cool about that one, it is practice agnostic. So they're not looking at like, what's the list of things, how are they doing things in terms of a list, like check, check, check. It's what's the outcome on the land. Is there more biodiversity? Is there more carbon sequestered in the soil? Is there more water holding capacity? And then that informs that certification program as to the fact that those practices actually happened, right? So it's trying to get away from that like list of things, but there's regenerative organic certified, like there's definitely some stuff happening, but it's taking some time to get to market in terms of like a big impact. But the other thing that we have to be careful about, and this is why I think localizing these movements is so important, is I don't want this to become organic. Organic started out so great and it became watered down and bastardized. It's like, unfortunately, you can't trust the organic seal anymore. But when you know the farmer and you know what their practices are and you have like a local market where they're supporting all of these people, like I trust Julie and I trust Cynthia for how they're sourcing because I know their thought process, right? So it's really that relationship thing. So I think it's gonna be more of like a local food hub aspect that's going to happen, as opposed to like how do we have these national chains like being held to these standards, that kind of thing. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think you just spoke to it. I'm just going to elaborate some of my thoughts about it.
Yeah, here, I'll stand by you.
Yeah,
So, microphone.
because I think it really truly is about recognizing that the sea change is the perspective that we take, and recognizing that it's never going to be a top-down solution ever.
Yep.
That the top-down solution has proven itself to be so susceptible to corruption and, as you said, bastardization, that the only way that we can turn things around is from the grassroots, from the ground up, from the community up. When you go to the market and you see the quality of the carrots and you taste the carrots and you take that in, if you have presence, which is healing our relationship with nature, if you have presence and awareness, you can tune in and realize how much better that feels to your body. It doesn't matter what it's labeled, it doesn't matter what stamp of approval. And this is kind of the tricky place because we've all been industrialized and institutionalized through schooling.
Yep.
And schooling, unfortunately, has been defined in such a way as to make us better consumers,
Yep.
not better producers. So what we're here to do is to produce life in symphony with nature.
Yep.
And I think that's the one thing that I find stumbling sometimes is the idea that how do we do this on a large scale so that it can be top down? Forget that.
Yep.
Flip it over, roll around in the dirt and start there.
Yep. Yeah, and I think how we scale, thank you for that, how we scale is by small people, like small producers, small land managers, that small operation aspect, that being that hub, and then that connecting with others. And so it's like when you go to this area here, like I go visit somewhere in Illinois, it's like I know where I can source food there that's supporting that local landscape and is nutrient dense and non-toxic because those farmers and ranchers are taking care of the soil. So I think it's more about, like the way we scale up is by the small and medium-sized operations that are really doing things right, and that is how it gets big. But it's not this like massive, industrial, like she was saying, top-down system. That's what really, it's so vulnerable. I mean, look at what happened with COVID. Like we watched all the supply chains kind of break down. Does anybody even know like how they would survive without that? Like we all shop at stores pretty much. And so I think it was like within 6 weeks, all farmers were out of food. So it just shows like how vulnerable that system is and how much we need to start creating a robust local economy. Yeah.
So if you can elaborate on that, if you have some ideas about how this can also, something you mentioned early in your talk, heal community.
Yep.
And how our community, it's become so broken down and we're so isolated, and how we can heal and support within local communities.
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to, like, if you look at more traditional ways of being and more ancient cultures, they had things that they did together all the time. Like we were just in Fiji, and the island that we were on was just, it was so cool to see the interconnection and like the real authentic connection of those people. It was like, I don't know, it was mind blowing to me because we came from the big island that looked very industrial. When you flew over it, there were like crop circles and like all the normal things you see flying over the US. But we went to this smaller island, and the interconnection and the local aspect and just the like lightness of the people was like medicine to my soul. It was amazing. Was it not? Just it was so cool. And they had things that they did together, like they have dances or rituals or whatever. They have kava that they like all come around and they drink this kava, which is from the root of kava plants. And it's like they have rituals. We've lost that. We've lost these more ritualistic ways of being with each other. And so we're in this more like transactional way of being. And it's like you go in, you buy something. Money is really the replacement.
We have ritual shopping.
Yeah, exactly. We have ritual consumerism. And what's interesting is like money is a replacement for relationships. So when you realize that, you're like, oh, I mean, if we were like in community with each other and you were producing something, I was producing something, we would just trade. But we've gone to this system of like, it has to be money. And so that has created an ability to be disconnected. So I think and this is why I'm not too overwhelmed, it might seem like a lot, but I feel like as we start to have these conversations and maybe we create things, like I've talked about doing maybe every 3 months, we do like a gathering to have conversations about like what things are people interested in doing and creating in our local communities. And as we do that in more places, then there's more connection, like knowing that another group in another area is doing the same thing. Like there's something really powerful about that. So I think that is one of the major solutions, is reconnecting with each other, reconnecting with nature, and then reconnecting nature to herself. I really think that's the recipe. And so, and as that happens, like the health that happens and the relationship building and just the health for the soul, it's just gonna happen. Like we're not gonna have to come up with lists. And I mean, if you know me well, you know I love lists and I'm trying to get away from that. But I really don't want to be in that space. It's like, how can we just be more authentic and connected and grounded, you know? So I hope that kind of answered. I love this. I love that we're talking about these things. See, this is part of the solution. Everything we need is right here. Does anybody else have any ideas or comments or questions? I think, and your earlier question, I think I answered everything. I was talking about water holding capacity, the carbon, yeah. Good.
I'll suggest a movie if people have not seen it here. It's called Polyfaces, and it's the farm from Joe Salato's family.
Yeah.
And it actually kind of chronicles a lot of what you're talking about how the soil was regenerated. It's actually very, it's very educational and also very warm-hearted.
Yeah.
It kind of helps to make you feel good about what's possible and what happens between people when that dance is going well.
Right. Yeah, I don't think I've actually seen that.
We also carry a book in the market about it.
From Joel? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you seen that one? I don't think I've seen that one either. I'm gonna have to look it up.
I'm sure it's on Netflix, or if not, you can probably go rent it somewhere, but it's called Polyfaces.
Okay, cool. Polyfaces. Huh?
Can't believe I haven't.
I know, right? I'm like,
The locals never go to the tourist attraction.
yeah. Exactly.
I know him, but I haven't watched this movie.
Right, I know. So, okay, cool, yeah. And actually, I put a resources page up on my website because I realized that I kept like individually emailing everybody like all of the things. And so if you go to projectdungbeetle.org/resources, I've put a thing where it's like some websites, some ways to find food, some videos, some books, like just trying to have a place where people can start diving in and getting, like to me, one of the most important things about this movement is we keep the authenticity of regenerative, because like we were talking about, it can so easily go into just this more industrial, it's already happening. And so how do we keep that authentic aspect? And that is, it's this. It's staying small, it's knowing people, it's knowing how food was produced. So, yeah. All right, cool. Thank you all so much for being here. Ta-da!